my role, not just as a teacher, but as a Black woman, as a Black mother. And so for this case, I approached care from a couple of lenses, racial, gender, and pedagogical. And I think that this intersectional approach is really necessary when we think about the conditions that Black educators, particularly those like myself, who teach in historically under-resourced and historically excluded communities with predominantly Black and brown students, take up here in our work. As a part of this discourse, I really thought about Roseboro and Ross and how they talk about if it's even possible to divorce the social from the familial, right? Like, is it possible for me to divorce how I care for my students in the classroom with the way that I show up every single day? So that's my building, guys. It's super cute. Like I said, Dr. King is an African American immersion school, and I think that it's important for me to name that. I like to name that in all spaces that I work in, because Dr. King is a cultural immersion school, not a language immersion school. So children who come to that school are immersed in African American culture from the minute they walk into the door until the time that they leave. It's in the language that we use when we speak with them. As you can see, there's kente cloth on the outside of our building. There's pictures of Dr. King. And you'll also get to see the inside of the building as well a little bit later. But I think that it's important to name that because I intentionally made the choice to work at Dr. King. Dr. King is a Title I school. It is 99% Black, and 100% of the students or scholars that we call them at my school are economically disadvantaged. So my care describes why I made this choice in spite of the inherent care needs that I knew they were gonna have walking into that building, and not because of them. Within this case, I wanted to also add to the scholarship about the way teachers of color make sense of their work in the care context in which they make pedagogical and professional choices. Additionally, within this case, I wanted to explore Roseboro and Ross's suggestion that care is a part of the inheritance of Black women educators. From watching maternal caretakers, modern Black women educators learn to be maternal caretakers themselves. So that's me and my babies. That was a classroom a few years ago. But I always have taken on this familial role in my classroom space. It reminds me a lot of like thinking about the way my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, my aunties cared for me. And so when I entered the classroom space, I wanted to take that same sort of care in my classroom with my students. And so rather than questioning like the maternal role of care, because I think that that is one of the double binds that we face as in a majority women-dominated profession, I really wanted to think about how Black women educators embrace care as a labor and as a requirement for shifting academic and life outcomes for Black students. I wanted to describe the way that Black educators like myself that are, this is a lot of words I'm about to use, politically and critically conscious, teacher activists, organizers who are committed to an abolitionist classroom praxis and that believe education is a tool for liberation from oppressive systems are also faced with oppressive double binds that create this slow burn that leads to burnout. Black educators embrace the idea of care as more than making students feel good about themselves. I think this is an important distinction first, because Black educators aren't a monolith, yet we often are positioned as such in the field of education. Meaning, right, like you have the one Black teacher in your building and they become the Black child whisperer, right? Sorry, I just lost my space. Second, being politically and critically conscious requires direct action to combat what Dr. Bettina Love calls the education survival complex. And so that picture you see right there is me marching in the streets with my union brothers and sisters. It was during a time when they were trying to do a spousal carve-out for insurance. We couldn't get cost of living, there were no raises available. And so that was me using my political voice. And so for Black educators like myself, teaching represents the political and as a way to teach Black students to think critically about the system in which they live, and those awakenings act as liberatory interventions that impact our students' lives in profound ways. I also examined care as a theory that does not yet adequately account for historical, ancestral, communal, and political connections. And I just want to say, like our children say, it's kind of giving very much colorblind. Like when we are having these conversations about care, there's no mention of race, there's no mention of historical or ancestral connections to care. And this is a picture of myself and a young lady that I mentor, me encouraging her to use her voice at a school board meeting to advocate for better learning conditions. So when I entered this process, I came into this process thinking that I would be examining care in the context of a liberatory care ethic in my classroom space. But on Wednesday, November 9th, that thinking shifted abruptly. So on that day, I was violently attacked by a parent at the end of the school day. It was, as you can see, there was a news story about it. And so it was just a regular school day. It wasn't a parent in my classroom. It was something that happened at the end of the school day. And so that really shifted the way I began to think about care. So it was 3 months after I was attacked that I ran into a parent from school. I wasn't gonna do this today. But this is a really good story. So she sees my husband first, we're at the grocery store. And she's like, do you have a wife? And he's like thinking that she's trying to hit on him. And he's like, yes. And she's like, no. I know your wife. You're Mrs. Harris's husband, right? And he says, yeah. And she comes out, because I was in the car. So she comes out to the car and she said, I saw your husband and I knew you wouldn't be too far away. And at that moment, that spoke to the care that not just I had for my scholars, but the care that my family had for my scholars as well. There would often be times in my classroom building where they would say, oh, where's the Harris family? Why isn't the Harris family here? Because they were so used to seeing all of us in the building together. And so I knew when I interviewed at Dr. King 7 years ago that was gonna be my home. I walked into this beautiful building and I saw myself, I saw my children, I saw my ancestors on the wall. There was a sign outside that said Harambe, which is a Swahili term that means pull together. It was our goal as a staff in that building to pull the community together, to come back together. And there was such a feeling of immediate care from the administrator at the time that I knew that I had no choice but to take the position at Dr. King. And so Dr. King is in a zip code 53206. It is the most incarcerated zip code in Milwaukee. It is has the highest rates of unemployment and the lowest income in the neighborhood. There's also a documentary about the school. And so the school may be historically under-resourced, and the school may have a lot of needs, but its culture and history are very rich. And so after the conversation ended with the parent, I broke down in tears like I just did right now. I'm a crybaby. But it was really me feeling like there was such a sense of guilt. It was really me feeling like I was letting my scholars down. I was letting that school community down because I was making the decision, the very selfish feeling decision, to prioritize my own care and healing instead of returning to the classroom. And so Wednesday, November 9th was the day the reality, like the real reality of double binds hit me. It like rushed over me. There was like just a wave of sadness and heaviness that I felt that day, because the oppression that had existed in the community collided with the oppression that existed in my school building. And it ultimately reflected how the education survival complex does not care for scholars or educators. Obligatory first day of school pick. So from the beginning of my time in the classroom, so I started my journey in early childhood. I did that for probably 20 years before I started teaching professionally, I guess that's what they call it. Teaching professionally for a public school. I know I look really young, y'all, but I'm old.
You still look young.
But I went into this wanting to show up with the pedagogy of exemplary Black educators, like exemplary Black women educators. The first person I named and hold space for is my aunt, Alice Pugh. She was a Black educator for 30 years in the same district that I worked for. She encouraged me to take on this role. But then also I think about folks like Marva Collins. I think about folks like Dr. Gloria Laston Billings. I think about folks like Dr. Farima. And so I wanted to embody what I thought that they brought into classroom spaces. And so I think about the way Boboff and Lafont describe this idea of an exemplary pedagogy shown by a Black educator. And they have to have the following characteristics. So they have to have an embrace of the maternal, right? We've talked about this idea of like the familial role that I hold in my classroom. They have to have political clarity, and they also have to take an ethic of risk. And so embracing the maternal, in my case, in my classroom, shows up like me buying snacks for my scholars, right? So that they aren't hungry and that they can learn, and basically really buying them anything that's related to their basic needs so that we can have a great day of learning and not be focused on those types of things. And so now I become responsible as an educator for societal failures. Simply to just be able to do my job every day. And this is just one of the ways that the education survival complex creates this slow burn for teachers. And especially Black women teachers that embrace this idea of maternal care. We have this quote hanging all over my classroom, many posters by Nelson Mandela, and it says, education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. My classroom space has the potential to liberate every little Black boy and girl that walks through those doors. And I believe that. And so it is my job to encourage them to think critically about the systems that they're being educated in, the systems that they live in, so that they can one day go out and change them. And so that is that idea of political clarity. And so having this clear understanding on how the education survival complex disproportionately fails and marginalizes some while embracing others also causes us as educators to recognize how we contribute to that system while simultaneously trying to fight to change it. This is a constant battle, and so that slow burn continues. I've often described teaching as my purpose. Like, if folks who know me, they know that I say like I'm walking firmly in my purpose as an educator. This is a calling that's bigger than me. And so there's an ethic of risk that I hold just by simply understanding that. Because that risk means that despite every decision of care I make to act today, I may not see the fruit of this work. I may never see a liberated world. I may never see a liberated society. Care for my scholars and their families is rooted in meeting them where they are and not where I think they should be. I do a lot of this by developing, trusting, and authentic relationships with my family. For so often, families have had these transactional relationships when it comes to school. We need them for something, so we're calling them, right? Like if you come to parent-teacher conferences, we need you to come to parent-teacher conferences, so we'll give you this. But there's never been an opportunity to build real, authentic, and intentional relationships with our families. And also in the city in which I live, our school district has not done a good job of educating our community. So there's a lot of distrust that the community holds when it comes to what's going to happen for their own children. And so I wanted to build these reciprocal relationships with my family, and this takes time that we do not have as educators. And so a lot of this would end up happening on my own time. And so now this slow burn begins to transition to burnout. And I'm not even realizing that it's happening. And you know, by the time I was attacked, the slow burn had already heated into burnout. I was already at the point where I was saying, I didn't know how much longer I could make it. And I think about those symptoms, like going home and being so tired, I could barely move. And, you know, being easily irritated once I get home by my family from the smallest things because I have been so stressed during the day. And those are just all of the ways that burnout is manifesting itself. And the reality is the fight against the system that I had taken on as a part of this liberatory ethic is continual, but it's also very hard. It is very difficult. And so following my attack, I took a leave from teaching to heal, which, right? However, being away from the continual fight against the educational survival complex, and I think Sarah kind of made this point, it really gave me time to like reflect on all of the ways that the care I was giving to my scholars was resulting in a cost for my own personal and familial care. It became abundantly clear to me during this time that I've been on leave that the education survival complex takes advantage of educators who care. It uses all of the characteristics that make us become teachers in the first place as weapons against us. Yep. If we don't work extra hours, if we don't fill in societal gaps, if we don't provide maternal care for our scholars, then we aren't good teachers. And rather than the system providing us resources and supports so that double bonds don't exist for educators like myself, the educational survival complex just takes advantage of it. It wasn't until I was physically attacked and forced to take a leave that I even had an opportunity to really reflect on the idea that this system wasn't just oppressing my scholars, it was oppressing me as well. I would argue that if we as educators have an ethical obligation to care for our students, then the education system has an ethical obligation to provide us with the resources and support to effectively do that, as well as care for ourselves. Educational systems where children are cared for and thriving should not come at the expense of teachers. A thriving educational environment means we all, students, families, and educators alike, have what we need to care for ourselves, for each other, and to thrive. Thank you.